We'll start now with Carl Rogers, and we might place this and say, to what extent do you feel you're true to yourself? And that's your true self, not the conditioned responses that we sometimes believe to be ourselves. So Carl Rogers, a colleague of Maslow, they were neighbors, in fact, for a while. He grew up on a farm, so he was used to lots of work that was alone, and lots of hard work, which may have led him to be a deep thinker. He started out in agriculture in college, but later on went on to study religion. But he changed to psychology, and then he eventually studied with Maslow, and as I said, they were neighbors, so their ideas could really kind of blossom in those impromptu interactions. And he's known for what is called client-centered therapy, or Rogerian therapy. So just a little joke. How many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is just one, but the light bulb has to want to change. And that isn't underneath of the whole idea of Rogerian therapy, is that it's designed for people who are ready to make this transformation in their lives. And this is designed to help to assist them along their way. We each have to help ourselves. Rogers does exist within that existentialist paradigm, and so he is very much about our responsibility to make choices in our lives. So, overview of his ideas. First off, he believes that we all have an actualizing tendency, which is a built-in motivation to fully develop our potentials, and that this is not just true of humans, it's true of all creatures. All creatures, even plants, strive to make the best of their existence. You know, a blade of grass reaches to be as tall as it can be. So we are consistent with them, and if they don't reach their optimal potential, then it's not because they don't want to, it's because of some other reason. And so a fully functioning person, then he would say, is actualized. And that means they're kind of similar to Maslow's definition, open to his or her own experience, living in the moment in an existential fashion, entwined with their constantly changing stream of consciousness. They're just present. And so client-centered therapy then guides this process, guides people to be able to actualize with positive regard and acceptance, and following where the client leads. So how does Rogers view the self? Well, the self structure, it just refers to the conceptual map of information about ourselves and the environment. I or me in relation to others, the way we experience ourselves in the world. He says that this is not permanent, it's ever changing, so it's a dynamic kind of feeling, and that if it's fluid and flexible, able to incorporate new experiences, we all have this potential, but sometimes we resist the fluidity and flexibility. And so we would do that by not allowing certain things into awareness. We might either not see it, like remember there are always things happening around us at all times, but we filter out information, focus on other information, and view that other information through the lens of our own bias. And so we can deny life's events, or we can accept and perceive what's happening. He also offers that we have a real or a true self, who you actually are at a given point in time, not the idea you have about yourself. And that we have then also an ideal self, and that really isn't the true self. It isn't the real self, because it's an internalized concept of who we think we should be, and it's based on pressure from outside sources, and that might not be consistent with our true self or what our true offering is in this world. So he gives us this idea of an ideal path versus a tainted path. And two of the terms then, just because they're in here, you should know what they are. He talks about actualization, and again, that's realization of your full potential. And then organismic valuing, which he says that each organism, including us and our own bodies, know innately. We're born knowing what's good and bad for ourselves. We often deny it as humans, but we know, our bodies know what's needed. And so then he says the ideal path would work something like this. We would go through this actualization process, seeking to desire our full potential. Along the way, we would innately know what we need to do that. And then others would regard us well as we do those things which we're called to on this thread of our own lives through our organismic valuing. That would lead to us regarding ourselves positively, and this would lead to this real self being able to flower and manifest in the world. But he says, by contrast, many of us lead a tainted path, and that is, instead of seeking our full potential or being able to get on that path, society tells us what we should be doing. Our culture, our clan, our people, our teen peers, whoever it is. And so that leads to conditions of worth. So instead of following this innate knowing of what we're needed, then we try and meet other people's conditions of worth that are placed upon us, which maybe leads others to view us well if we meet those conditions of worth. So then others may view us well instead of positive regard as we go on our true path. And this can lead to conditional positive self-regard. We only look at ourselves well if we are meeting these expectations of society. And so this leads to this like phony self, this ideal self based on the definitions of society instead of being true to who we ourselves actually are. And this incongruence between the real self, this knowing self who has this thread of life that should be followed as maybe destiny, as Rollo May might put it. Instead, we're doing this ideal self and we're not true to ourselves. Ourselves remain latent, the real self remains latent and hidden. And so we can have incongruence then between how we optimize our potential and society's goals. Threatening situations can lead to like feeling these conditions that are placed on us of our worth instead of being true to what we know innately, which can lead to anxiety to get the positive regard of others because it's conditional on these societal pressures placed on us instead of our own positive regard, the positive regard for our true path, which can lead us to put up defenses against our own, as we form our own self-regard. And he calls this the shattered self. We have not found our true self. And when he works therapeutically with people, he really is trying to help them recognize the tainted path, but more importantly, find and become true to the ideal path, the path that is meant to be for an individual. So the congruence and incongruence. Congruence is just like things are aligned. Congruence is when one experiences a close connection between real self and ideal self. So there's not this people are expecting things of you which are not true to who you are. Incongruence then is this discrepancy between what a person feels they ought to be and what they actually are. So there's like a dissonance there. And so this might be denial. The person might deny the real self and not accept their own imperfection on that ideal self. And that's sort of like along the lines of what Karen Horney talked about. Symbolization is the process by which a person becomes aware of his or her own experiences and symbolize them internally. Like, for example, in an unfortunate way, if someone's been a lot punished for being angry, then that girl, if it's a female, this often happens, girls are sort of not supposed to be angry, then she might view anger and connect it to the symbol of bad girl. And so then she wouldn't be being true to her authentic self. I mean, the emotion of anger can be just and doesn't have to result in angry actions or words. But the emotion of anger can serve a purpose of motivating action or change. So this is sort of a symbolized unfortunate symbol. And then subception is this process by which a person senses or receives a stimulus from the environment, but doesn't allow it to reach full awareness. So engaging a defense mechanism, and so they may outer things may be happening in the world around. Like we may be receiving positive feedback, but we don't allow that in. We don't allow it to be symbolized internally for us because we already have entrenched symbols guiding who we think we are. So then again, this is the model of the shattered self. We have this incongruence between the real self and the true self. So there's neurosis that's developed. And then we have those threatening situations. That is situations where there are these conditions of worth that we may or may not be able to meet, leading to anxiety about the regard of others, leading to defenses against our real self who might not be aligned with these conditions of worth, increased incongruence, and then as we have this repeated pattern, that's when the shattered self emerges, the loss of who this person is at all. So in client-centered therapy, Rogers is really helping, it's really facilitating the client as the client themselves find the way to those restored good pathways, the ones that were on the left of the earlier slide. And so the client-centered therapy would help people to understand cognitive distortions, such as those we talked about with Beck. So there is some correction of changing of thinking. But the therapist more often might provide empathic reflection. So the client would be talking, and then the therapist would kind of reflect back some aspect of that the client might then give more thought to. An example, the client might say, "I'm just worrying about every little thing lately." And the therapist would say, "Oh, you've got a lot on your mind," and just let the client continue. And so the discussion would be supportive, but not reconstructive. And so by that we mean the client has to do the work. The therapist can just support the path. And you can think about the child learning to ride a bike. You know, there can be support at first. The parent can go alongside and hold that bike upright, but in the end, the child has to take off on their own. And that's a good analogy for the role of the therapist in this model. And it's not reconstructive, not trying to rebuild or tell the client what to do. The client has to find the way. The therapist just serves as training wheels. And so to work in this model, therapists need to have 3 characteristics. And the first is congruence, like to be really genuine with the client, like they have had to work through their own stuff. And then they have to be able to be their real selves. If in the Rogerian approach, if the therapist doesn't feel that they have like a good resonance with the client, they might recommend them to someone else instead of trying to work with them. Because empathy is another part of this, feeling what the client feels. And that's part of being genuine with the client. And then respect, well, this like acceptance of all parts of what this person is, unconditional positive regard. No more conditions of self-worth, unconditional positive regard and acceptance, grounded in this genuine respect. So the key points of this content are that this is the Rogerian approach, all organisms seek to maximize their potential with an actualizing tendency, and this includes plants and animals and humans, all organisms. Humans have a real self with strengths and failings, and an ideal self consisting of goals that are formed by society. An ideal path is one in which an individual seeks to actualize through organismic valuing, which is this innate knowing of what he or she needs. And then they receive positive regard from others as they find their way and develop strong self-regard for their real self, including their faults, their true, authentic self. A tainted path, on the other hand, starts with society's demands based on conditions of worth, leading to conditional regard from others if they meet those conditions, and then conditional self-regard and an ideal self, which might not be consistent with the real self at all. Incongruence between the real self and ideal self leads to neurosis. And Rogerian therapy then supports clients who are trying to find that true path or to reactivate the path that is not tainted by society's demands.